I see about Judy here this morning. This is his HaEmuna, Judah.
Yeah.
But one, really big. It's a big positive. Did you go to Sefer?
Yeah, last week.
What's that?
Rabbi was last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was here last week.
I think I gave them all out.
Okay, so forget it. Yeah. That's exactly what it is.
Moshe, you did about Israel.
Yeah. I don't know if you were asking me or telling me that, but
No,
yes,
no,
he's in
he's in Israel. Yeah. So it's Moshe's Sefer.
Okay. I'll just leave it with you after, okay?
Yeah, 100%. You don't have to give it back to a person. Take care of it. Everything is back to Judah.
We're on page Lamed Hey, in ViYesod HaChassidus of Gershon, Henoch, Radzin. The Rabbi Susilan is talking about what happened after the Stalkus of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What happened to the Chachma after the Stalkus. So on page Lamed Hey, V'achar Chasimus HaShas. V'achar Chasimus HaShas. Nishar b'dei Rabbanan Savrei v'Aganim HaMiyuchadim. After the Bavli and the Yerushalmi and the Bavli were sealed, were finished, which, as we learned, the Chachma and the Steres is woven into every word, every letter of Shas, but in a way that's very, very, very covered. As we learned, Chasam b'gushpanket, the parasol is sealed in iron. After the Nishmas HaChassidus, Nishab de Rabbanis of Rabbi Ganim Yachadim. The Chachma, this Chachma of ViYesod remained in the hands of Rabbanis of Roy, following Shas and the Gaonim, but not all. Kodesh Matzinu, Divrei Meksuvim, talking about the Gaonim in Bavel. Kodesh Nimtza B'Yadenu B'Or HaGaonim Al Shemais. We do have some explanations of the Gaonim that have survived all of the years regarding the names of Hashem. The Sefer HaEmuna, Rav Chamai Gaon, which has in it some hints of this Chachma. Achein Divreim Ne'elamim Ma'od. However, the teachings of Kabbalah are very, very hidden and covered in the writings that we have from the Gaonim. However, we do have a number of svarim from the Gaonim following the Chasima of Shas. We do have a number of svarim that were written in a way of more of a philosophical, Chakir Elokis, religious philosophy, more in that way. Vistira Omek Kavanasam B'Mesek L'Shanam. And they concealed the depth of their kavanah, which was Pnimiyus HaTorah, in the sweetness of their language, of their writing. They had a way of hiding and concealing the Kabbalah. But when you look carefully at these writings of the Gaonim, one can see that they knew Sisrei Torah, that they were connected to this Chachma. Achein ma'od histiru derveim. It was very, very covered. Achein nimtza perish Sefer Yetzirah, L'Hari, Abarbaloni. ViYesod mizman, also in the commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah. ViYesod mizman hu svarim chadashim, Sisrei Torah b'loshen nistam ma'od. So what we have from that period of time, following the Gemara, the period of the Gaonim, we have such a way of Kabbalah being given over in Loshen Nistar Ma'od, very hidden. You can say Fakana v'Arayvad b'Biur l'Sefer Yetzirah. V'chein b'Dorosh Achareim Chibru Svar. Yesh Shahayel Ham Kabbalah Shlema v'Yestiru D'Veim b'Loshen HaMechkar. In some of these Svarim, we're able to see that they were masters of the Kabbalah, but they concealed and they hid this knowledge in a language that was more philosophical. And those who had this true Kabbalah, they were mekavein el ha'emes, to the truth. However, there were some who did not have a Kabbalah shleima, did not have the whole Chachma of Kabbalah, and we find, he says, Gimgumu b'lashanim. Gimgumu literally means to stammer. But we find that in these Svarim, it's not clear that they were Makavan al ha'emes. There were some Svarim that, from that period of time, where it's not clear that they had a grasp of this Chachma. Sheb emes sherish HaKabbalah hu chakir elokis b'chal ha'pratim b'shleimus. Because in truth, the root of Kabbalah is Chakira Elokis. It's Chakira, which means to study, to investigate, to inquire, an Elokus. V'chol pratim b'shleimus, pratim b'shleimus, and all the details b'shleimus. V'yas solas anakia v'habrura menufa b'shloshes nafos. However, the difference is that whereas in philosophy, there's all kinds of mistakes and confusion and so on, but Kabbalah is menufa, means it's filtered with 13 shloshes nafos. It's 13 filters, and it's pure. Shekabbalah min hasharish, from the root, min hasharish yeda kol hamistayif mimenu, and from the root one is able to understand all that comes forth from it. B'chakir ha'iyunis, however, when it comes to those Hakiras that were with human intellect, not the Kabbalah, not the tradition of the Chachma and the Steres, but from the minds of great people who were trying to understand intellectually the shorish of things. Yesh harbe psolis, meruba al. There's more psolis than food. I think there's more that's not. Psolis, of course, means like with being borer, the psolis is the refuse, the garbage. There's more psolis than the food. Shachakira, he nivnis arayos v'hakeshim and amuchash el mash lamal v'natava. Because when it comes to philosophical inquiry, all the philosophy, even as brilliant and as great as those people were, we're talking about the Jewish philosophers at the time from the Golim and then following in the Middle Ages by the Rishonim, as great as they were, Sof Kol Sof Hakira is built upon proofs that come from proofs that come from this world, min hamuchash, from the world that we know, al mashal ma'alamatava. But they're trying with the human mind, using this world as a means of understanding something that's higher than this world. It's not of this world. Therefore, that which is not tangible, that which is not part of the reality that we are able to see with our eyes, they're not able to understand. So they're trying to trace the way back from looking at this world, and by studying this world, to be able to work their way backwards up to the higher world, to what's higher than this world, what transcends this world. But they're working their way backwards, from studying the world to try to understand. In other words, by studying physics to understand metaphysics, by studying this world to ascend to a higher world through the human intellect, which is finite. So they're studying with the finite human intellect, finite reality, and in their brilliance, they're trying to trace back finite reality to that which is higher than finite, to the infinite. And naturally, there are going to be many, many mistakes. Al pirov, mishu basha. Al pirov, mostly these are their mistakes. Those that had Kabbalah, the Kabbalah, there we see that they're makavna la'emes, we see the truth. But those who did not have the Kabbalah, it's filled with mistakes and distortions. Kodesh. As it says in the Zohar Kodesh, Shebahar beiteven yesh garin echad shel chita. That there's a lot of straw, and in all of you'll have a whole big bunch of straw, and in all of that you could find maybe one seed of wheat. So there maybe are certain insights that are found in all of this, but it's mostly straw. It's mostly straw. Now, those who have been Hashem, who have joined the learning the Leiner of the Rambam every day, just this past couple of days, this past week, now Hashem we're already in Yesod Torah, and yesterday was in the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and so on, but and today's with the Kiddush of the Shemus. However, we went through a few days in the Rambam where the Rambam was presenting his scientific understanding of creation, of Ma'aseh Bereishis, of the world, and the question is, like, what is that? I mean, those who are learning it, the Rambam's picture of reality, and from there, a reality that's higher than this world, is very, very, very different, even on the most basic level of the Earth being at the center of the universe, or not being at the center of the universe. There are many, many things there that over time have been completely disproven scientifically. And as far as the metaphysics are concerned, don't stim with Pnimiyus Torah, with Kabbalah. And the question is how to understand this, how to learn this, and how to understand this. The Rambam, of course, was the greatest of all of those Chaykrim Elokim, those godly philosophers. So, we're going to talk about that in a second, about the Rambam. But so this was with in the world of the Rambam, the planets have seichel. The planets are not inanimate clumps of physical reality, but something higher than that. So achein gama kabbalah shlema. So the Rabbi writes at the bottom of the page, Lamed Hey, achein gama kabbalah shlema. Even when it comes to Kabbalah, in nichtav b'lashon hamechkar, when it's written in the language of philosophy, liyaspik lashon hamechkar levaer dei beir. Even those who did have this Kabbalah, who did receive the Kabbalah, who were trying to conceal it in the language of philosophy, liyaspik lashon hamechkar levaer dei beir. The language of philosophy cannot possibly fully explain, even in a very hidden way, cannot fully explain this chachma. Therefore, most of them, what's missing is it's really missing. Next page, because of their great effort to conceal Kabbalah underneath the language of philosophy, the understanding, the intent, in most cases is lost. And we find that these philosophers, even though they're the ones that had a true Kabbalah, that they're writing at great length to try to explain many, many things. Where in Kabbalah, one or two words already would contain all of this, which they're struggling over many pages to try to talk about. In Kabbalah, once it's uncovered, it's a word or two. Shukol Kama V'Kamal Gilyonis. It could be many, many pages. Umamar B'Lashon HaMechkar, in the language of philosophy. We could go on, for instance, now he talks about the Rambam. Kama Prakim B'Mar Nevuchim. There are a number of chapters at the beginning of the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, at the beginning of Mar Nevuchim. Ba'achokas Agashmis. The Rambam, at the beginning of Mar Nevuchim, writes very strongly against the Haksham of Hashem, seeing Hashem as being, as Chalila, as being something, there's something physical to Hashem, the corporeality of God, of Hashem. He writes very strongly to explain that whenever it says in Tanakh, the hand of Hashem, the eyes of Hashem, it doesn't mean anything physical, and the whole Sefer begins, Mar Nevuchim begins with a long discussion proving the incorporeality of Hashem. Therefore, the Rambam needs to explain the different words that are being used to talk about Hashem, and what those names, what those words mean, and how do we understand the names by which Hashem is referred to in Tanakh. When you look in the Zohar Kodesh, there's one or two words, where it says something along the lines of that this name of Hashem is referring to the midah of the spheres of Zer Anpin. And that's all the Zohar has done. It doesn't have any more of a discussion. Those who understand what Zer Anpin means know. And as all of the Rambam's many pages on this subject are all in those words, Ahu b'Zer Anpin itma. Zer Anpin means that when the Torah uses, when Tanakh uses such lashonos as Hashem's eyes, Hashem's hands, it's not talking about the atzmis of Hashem. It's not talking about Atzilus. It's talking about Zer Anpin. It's talking about the lower spheres and so on. It's talking about his galus of the Or of Hashem. It's not talking about Hashem himself. There's nothing to worry about. We're not talking about Hashem himself. We're talking about the Or of the spheres, of how Hashem created the world, and the Tzimtzum, and after the Tzimtzum, and so on. So Rabbi Shimon doesn't have to launch into pages and pages of proofs that that the eyes of Hashem doesn't mean eyes like we have eyes. It doesn't have to go into that. Kol Amar Mahem. And it has in it all. It contains all in the Zohar Kodesh. All of this is the Chochmah Hanisteres, whereas these discussions in philosophy are already in the world of Bina, that goes into details and details and details in Bina. These are two ways of learning Torah now as well. You can learn Torah in a way of Chochmah, and you can learn Torah in a way of Bina. And the Nigla of Torah is written is given over to us in the way of Bina, where the Nigla of Torah is going into details and details and details and pratim and machlokes and so on, where the Chachma of Kabbalah is given with the Or of Chachma, without all of the machlokes and in a very, very clear way. So even if we are to believe, which is debatable, that those Rishonim had the Kabbalah Amitis, and they only wrote it in such a way, which was a way of concealment, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to figure out how they were makaven to the truth and what they wrote, and how the truth somehow got lost in all of the many, 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 many pages and discussions and arguments and philosophical speculations and so on over the course of these of the writings of these Sefer. What do you want to say?
I'm just trying to analyze in my mind if it's the same as any other profession that has a nomenclature that nobody understands, and it takes years for doctors to learn that nomenclature.
I guess it could be used as a muscle as a muscle to explain this. But,
is it accurate muscle? That's
what's the difference if it is? Okay, it's a muscle. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. And it's clear that from the Sefer Nevuchim, Sha'ar lo Kabbalah. Now here, Rabbi Gershon Henoch is one of those tzaddikim who made a case for the Rambam being a hidden Kabbalist. Now, there is a very big machlokes regarding this question of the Rambam, whether the Or of the Zohar Kodesh was known to the Rambam. It was the question of whether he knew it. The Chidah brings down from Chaim Vital and others that the Rambam was not zoche for the Or of the Zohar Kodesh. He did not see, he did not know at all of the Or of the Zohar Kodesh. And the Chidah writes that we see that there are many places where the Rambam will write something where the only source for that is to be found in the Zohar Kodesh, or the Tikkun Zohar. Again, over the past few days in the Limud of Rambam Yomi, if you look in the Ma'ar Mekaymis that have been printed in new editions of the Rambam, you'll find that many of these things that the Rambam says, it says the source is Tikkun Zohar, Tikkun Zohar, Tikkun Zohar. And it's not found in the Medrash, it's not found in Shas, it's found only in the Tikkun Zohar. So obviously for Rabbi Gershon Henoch and some others, that is a strong proof that the Rambam had access to the Chachma of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We don't find these teachings in any other Sfarim besides the Zohar Kodesh. So what the Chidah writes and others write is that because the Rambam was an Ish Kodesh, he was zoche to be mekaven el ha'emes. In other words, in a number of places, the Rambam was zoche to write the truth al pi the Zohar Kodesh, not because he learned the Zohar or that he was exposed to the Zohar, but because of the Shiur and his own access to higher madregas of ruchnius, that he was zoche to write certain things that were makavein to what is found in the Zohar Kodesh. Again, we don't have the exact wording. There's no place where it's the exact wording of the Zohar Kodesh, but concepts in the Zohar Kodesh that the Rambam was makavein to. But as the Chidah says, one second, that's not a proof. That's not a proof that he had the material and that he had the Kabbalah of Rabbi Shimon, but that he was makavein el ha'emes. And this view of how to understand those places where the Rambam is writing certain certain ideas that are only to be found in the Zohar. This is also the view of the Ben Ish Chai in his Shuas Rav Parlam, and many of the Talmidei Baal Shem, the Avei Nochal, and other tzaddikim believe the same way. In the commentary of the Migdal Oiz on Yesod Torah, the first parak that we learn, there he brings a famous I can't call it really a viewpoint, but some sort of a Masorah that at the end of his life, the Rambam was Isaac in Kabbalah, and the fact that he wrote in a way of philosophy is because the Derech HaEmes, as he writes the Migdalos, was Nelemes Ma'od, like we just learned, that the truth of the Zohar Kodesh was had to be kept very, very hidden, and it was only given mipeh el peh b'chashai, only from mouth to mouth, in a secretive way. Therefore, the Rambam would never write it openly. That this is the Kabbalah, this is the Zohar. He would never ever write it openly, as we learned that there was this iron seal, and the Rambam was faithful to that, according to these opinions. The Abarbanel also brings in his parish Nachlas Ovis on Pirkei Ovis. He writes there at the end of the third parak that he was told, or he met, I don't recall, an old man who met the Rambam in his old age, and the Rambam spoke about a certain chachma that he now had, that had he had that when he was younger, everything would have been different. And we're sort of left with this very, very mysterious apocryphal information, and we really don't know what to do with it. But Rabbi Gershon Henoch was believed firmly, as we're going to see, that the Rambam was a Mekubal. And the Rambam's Kabbalah was very, very, very hidden. And as the Rambam himself writes in his introduction to Mardavuchim, his teachings would be intentionally misleading for those who did not fully understand what he was talking about, which means most of the human race, and that's why Mardavuchim is not part of our curriculum generally. When learning, it was once the subject of tremendous study and debate and so on, but it no longer is. There are people out of interest, of course, learn it, and we believe that it's a holy Sefer. And there were many who kept it in their home, but it was locked. It was kept there, but it was locked in the home, not to learn Mardavuchim. Binyam, you wanted to say something?
According to those on the other side, the Rambam got it through Ruach HaKodesh, not logical derivation.
Right. Not through logical derivation, that his seichel was a seichel eloki. His mind was blessed with something, not just to understand the physical, but the metaphysical. And therefore there are insights there that come from a higher place. And that's the only way to understand how there are certain comments that we find from the Rambam where he was makaven el ha'emes.
Can Rabbi give an example?
Well, let's learn. Yeah. So he says. You see where it says a little dugma. We'll get to it in a minute. So he says, Rabbi Gershon says, I'm not going to go into this. The question: did he have the entire corpus of Kabbalah? In other words, was the Rambam dealing with the whole Chachma, the whole Praten, all the details of the Chachma? Did he have the Zohar Kodesh? However, we do find Ramazim, where the Rambam hinted to us that he had access to true Kabbalah. And most of those who were opposed to the Rambam, as you know, the Rambam was extremely controversial, and he had many misnagdim. And even most of those who were his misnagdim, Yardu Lahatzil Klape Shekasa Rambam Zal, it's a little bit unclear what he's saying here, is that they were concerned that, in other words, they knew that the Rambam was onto something. They were concerned that the Rambam was letting out certain things that was going to confuse the masses, that was going to cause all kinds of terrible confusion. that Yodel Hatzel Klapik Shekosar Ramzal Yovdu Elef, that many would be lost and many would be harmed by his teachings. They were, and they felt that the Misnagdim felt that they were trying to save both the Hamon Am of the Jewish people and the Rambam from having aggravation. But Rabbi Gershon Henoch says that they also knew that there was something different about the Rambam's mind. It wasn't just his brilliance, but there was something there, that he had access to Kabbalah Amitis. Whether it was the whole Kabbalah or not the whole Kabbalah, Rabbi Gershon Henoch says he's not going into that right now. Now, Uladugma, for example, Uladugma, Atsikpo Eze Protem. I'm going to give you a few examples, some details. Sheyachichu shahayil Kabbalah Amitis. It will prove that the Rambam had Kabbalah Amitis. Lashakosov Sefer B'Lashon HaMechkar. He wrote the Sefer in a language of philosophy. Ve'hevi das HaPhilosophem. And the Rambam quotes throughout Mar Nevuchim the opinions of the philosophers, of the non-Jewish philosophers, Greek and Muslim philosophers. Maybe das a philosopher. And there were other great tzaddikim from the Rishonim who continued along that path of the Rambam. Al Sefer Kodesh Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel. Lo laman chakor b'chakira. Not because they were trying to use philosophical inquiry, lo v'lodas mitzius Hashem Yisbarach mitoch chakirosam, to prove Hashem's existence with rational philosophical proofs. In other words, not that their faith was based upon chas v'shalom, based upon intellectual inquiry and proofs, scientific or otherwise, historical, scientific, whatever, all the proofs that we find in these Sefer and many of the other Sefer. The Emuna of these tzaddikim, of these Rishonim, their Emuna was transcended, was much higher, of course, than all of their intellectual chakiras, all of their chakiras. We'll see footnote Chafalf in a minute. But they were living at a time where, the same way nowadays, people will talk about business or about sports and other things. They were talking about philosophy. Philosophy was the subject of the times. And they were living in that culture where intelligent people were studying philosophy, and their worldview was based upon the philosophy that was being taught everywhere, and therefore these tzaddikim felt that they had to speak in the language of the time they were living in order to contend with the challenge of philosophy and all of the mistakes that would be made in the ikarim of Emuna due to the misunderstanding or the distortions that are found in philosophy. That's why the Rambam calls the Sefer Mora Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, which was, of course, not written in Hebrew; it was written in Arabic. Laharis HaNevuchim b'daitam, in order to guide those who were confused because of what they had studied in philosophy. And therefore, it was necessary for them to use the correct views of the philosophers and to disprove the incorrect views of the philosophers. And if they would not have brought the views of the philosophers, no one would have learned. No one would have used this form. They would have just continued on with all the distortions by studying the books of the non-Jewish philosophers. Because at that time, the vision of true knowledge, as we learned of Pnimius Torah, was nistam ma'od, was very, very hidden. And therefore, any rank and file Jew who wanted to understand what is Yiddishkeit, what is Emuna, and what does it mean that Hashem is what's the hashgach, that Hashem knows everything that's going on, and how is Hashem mashpia, how's the shefa of Hashem coming into this world? So anybody who wanted to understand that, nifna l'sefer hakira, they would go to the library or to the store, and they would get Sefer Hakira. They would get books of philosophy. And therefore, the Rishonim were fighting valiantly against the study of these books, and put these books into. There were many charamim that were signed by the Gedolim to forbid the study of philosophy.
All Goyish. They weren't other Jewish philosophers. They're forbidding all Goyish philosophers.
No, also Jewish philosophy, the study of Jewish philosophy as well. There were charamim against the writings of the Rambam and others as well. Because at that time, people were Jews who were the more learned Jews were as dependent upon the teachings of Aristotle as the bread that was baked in the bakery. Because that was their way of understanding Elokus, was philosophy. And if the Rambam and the others would not bring the opinions of the philosophers, nobody would have bothered learning the Sefer of the Rambam or the others. So what did the Rambam and Rav Chazda Kreskas and the Balaked and the Bali Karam and so on, what did they do? They showed respect to philosophy, and they brought the views of the philosophers that worked out with the views of Torah, and they disproved philosophically those that didn't, or with proofs, philosophical and from Tanakh and so on, and from Chazal, to contend with the mistaken views of the philosophers. But they had to invite philosophy into the ball game, and they had to present their views, or else the Chacham and the Tzaddikim would not have been studied, their Sefer would not have been studied, and they would have been completely discredited. So that once they brought the views of the philosophers, and then they were able to disprove those mistaken ideas of the philosophers, as Darshu Sifreim, and as Batleis Yisrael, they'll say, then as a result of that, so there was great interest among the learned Jews to study the Svarim of the Rishonim, and even going into time past it, a little bit past the Rishonim, to study the Svarim, and to come out with at least a healthy Jewish view of the Ikarim of Emuna, as opposed to being completely mistaken by accepting the minus and the apikorsis that was found in the non-Jewish philosophy, the writings of philosophy. So the Rambam and the others set out to save Klal Yisrael from the philosophers, but in order to do that, they had to descend into that world, and they had to operate in that world of philosophy. Look at footnote Chaf Aleph, back on page Lamed Vav. Again, we didn't yet get, there are going to be examples, he didn't get to it yet, of where we do see that the Rambam, where the Gershon Henoch uses as proof, that the Rambam is speaking about some things that are not found anywhere else, one example is in the halachas of Peyos Harosh, of the Peyos. There are things that are not found anywhere else except in Kabbalah. We'll get to that, but look at footnote Chaf Aleph. Ki ein la'gila amuna idei chakiras. One cannot come to pure amuna through philosophy. It's filled with all kinds. Again, even the philosophy of the Rambam and the other tzaddikim, there are things that are found there that are not the emes, that are not the truth. Rabbi Avram Schusi Aleinu, Al-Maimar Kosov, Acheker Eloka Timsa. Can one find God through intellectual inquiry? In other words, you can't find Hashem through the seichel. Can one really understand Elokus, working his way up from that which is finite, which is the human mind? Hashem is Baruch is a Metzias that's higher than the intellect. How could human intellect possibly understand that which is higher than what's human? It's only possible through Emuna. Which transcends the intellect. Can one comprehend Elokus? And he explains more over there. B'Shem Moshe Mekabrin, these are Talmidei Baal Shem, from the world of Slonim and Lechovitz. V'zel Lashon Kodesh. Moshe Mekabrin says, Emuna Megaz ad l'Mekarmis Hagvarim v'Yoser. Faith reaches and comes from a place that's very, very high. There are many things that a person can be masik intellectually, and the mind can reach. However, when it comes to faith itself, that is not the case. Faith takes a person to a place where the mind can't reach, and the mind, the intellect, will rise up against that emuna. It's higher than any of the hasagas of the human intellect. And that's what David Melech was saying, that only through faith in Hashem can one encircle Elokus, can one grasp Elokus. I can connect to you, Hashem, only through Emuna, not through philosophy, science, and so on. The Bnei Yissaschar, of course, was one of the great opponents to the study of philosophy. And he writes, anybody whose ancestors stood at Har Sinai, and anybody who truly wants Torah Hashem, even when it comes to understanding the simple pshat in Torah, and to understand the conversations and the arguments of Habai and Rava in the Gemara and so on, he has no need to waste any time studying philosophy. To try to find philosophical proofs, scientific or philosophical or historical proofs from Metzias Hashem for God's existence, Yichudo and Hashem's oneness, all the other basic ikarim, the basic fundamental ikarim of Emuna. Not to do this with philosophy at all. Anybody whose ancestors stood at Har Sinai is fully satisfied and finds the truth just by studying Torah itself, without any confusion or sveikas. That's not Rabbi Yaakov Renden, that's Rabbi Yosef Yaibitz, who lived at the time of the expulsion from Spain. She'enav Rob is a famous thing from him where he wrote, She'enav Rob b'shas gzeres shmad. He saw with his own eyes at the time of the Inquisition. That the big philosophers, those Jews who were the big thinkers, the big philosophers, asher omdu al HaEmuna b'mechkar, whose faith, whose emuna was based upon mechkar, was based upon philosophy and so on. When it came to the Inquisition, they converted. They gave up their faith and they gave up Yiddishkeit and they converted. They went along out of fear that they would be sent into exile or they would be killed. But those Jews who lived with Emunas HaTorah, even women and simple Jews, they were Mekadesh Shem Shamayim. They gave up their lives to die al Kiddush Hashem with the Emunah that they had. The philosophers, for the most part, did not die al Kiddush Hashem. They saved them. They saved their skins. And all of their hakiras and all of their thousands of pages that they read and they wrote, when it came down to it, didn't convince them enough to be prepared to die al Kiddush Hashem. There were still enough questions left that said, I think I'd rather continue on and try to figure out more of this stuff as a Christian or as a Muslim. Vinay also says, bringing from Rabbi Yosef Yavitz, you would have thought just the opposite. These are such geniuses, and they had such proofs. You would think that these proofs are so solid that it was kilu. They saw God through their great intellect and their great proofs. But it's just the opposite. The simpler Jews, not the philosophers, are the ones who were prepared to die al Kiddush Hashem and did die al Kiddush Hashem. Faith that is based upon, not that a person doesn't study some of these things as well, just to add some interesting concepts to his arsenal of understanding. But if your Emuna is based upon man's intellect is finite, and therefore when it comes down to it, and you're challenged with the question of giving up your life and accepting your own end, just as your seichel is finite, so too life is finite, and it would not take you beyond that finite way of looking at things. Would not take you to something where you believe in the infinite after death. So these people whose emunah was based upon finite philosophical inquiry, their emunah was limited. It had a certain limitation, and it was fine to talk about, over a cup of coffee, or to argue about, after Musaf or something, or in a Kiddush club to talk about philosophy. But when it came to the question of whether you're going to jump into a fire, I think I'd rather not do that for now. When they were being forced to make this decision between being a Jew or being not Jewish, however, that's not the case when it comes to Emunah mitzad ha'ein sof baruch hu. When a person's belief is in the ein sof, when the source of one's belief is from the infinite, from above, not from below. Ein l'emunah hazasof. Just as Hashem is infinite, the faith of a Jew is infinite, and is not intimidated by all of the threats and by even that ultimate test of ending one's life being ended. This emunah that is pure, that comes from the depths of the heart of a Jew. It's stronger even than emunah that comes by seeing something even with your own eyes. You might see something, not just intellectual speculation, but even stronger than what a person sees with the eyes. As the Rambam writes in Sfasemes, the faith, the strength, the Sfasemes writes of Jewish faith, is very strong. It's very strong. It's very dear to Hashem, our Emuna. And the faith that a Jew has is stronger and to the Jew than what he sees with his own eyes, and is more dear to the person than what he sees with his own eyes. And the truth of the matter is that Rambam himself writes The Rambam writes in his Parish on Shemona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avos, and in other places, that even the Rambam writes that in order for a person to be Masik Deos, in order for him to even intellectually comprehend the true Deos, a true understanding of Yiddishkeit, he has to purify his heart, and he has to purify his midas. So the Rambam himself said that it's not just a matter of being bright or being a genius. Unless you purify, that's why we're going to go now in the Rambam from Hilchos Yesodei Torah to Hilchos Deis. Unless a person refines his midas and his heart is purified, he's going to make all kinds of mistakes, even in his understanding of philosophy, and all of his hasagas are not going to. All of his intellectual hasagas are not going to bring him to the truth, because sof kol sof, this person who has not refined his midas is a Baal Taiva. And in the end, he's going to believe what he wants to believe because of his taivas. And if his taivas is telling him that it's okay to sit with your girlfriend in shul or something, he'll figure out a philosophical way to prove that. And that's why many, many, many years later, that Rabbi Chana Wasserman writes about this in his Kovetz Aris on Yevabis. Rabbi Chana writes about how do we understand that these great geniuses, the Gedolei HaPhilosophim, were not able to come to the understanding that every little boy in Cheder, every little girl in school understands, and these great philosophers were not able to come to that. And Rabbi Chanan writes, as the Rambam wrote in his time, that Aristotle was a huge Baal Taiva. I mean, I have stories about Aristotle being a big Baal Taiva. And Plato and the rest of that chevra, they were big Baal Taiva, and they had to come to certain philosophical conclusions that would give them the green light to go on with the indulging, being able to indulge in their taivas. So the Rambam writes that in order to understand even intellectually the truth of Emuna, one has to be a tzaddik. One has to make himself to a tzaddik. You have to lift yourself up to a place where your heart is refined, and then your heart will reveal to your mind these truths. But if you're filled with imperfections, and you're Baal Taiva, and you're angry, lazy, v'chulei, so then your deos are going to be marred and puzzled and damaged by a heart that is impure, by a heart that is not strong in its faith, which really, in essence, supports what we've just been learning from the Bnei Sasser and the other tzaddikim, that the shorish of Emuna is to be found in the heart of a Jew, not in the mind of a Jew. And the heart of a Jew means a place that is not dependent upon diagrams and charts and statistics and proofs, but something that transcends that, which is Elokus and the shorish of Nishmas Yisrael. Now, examples of that the Rabbi Gershon Henoch brings of the Rambam's Deus and the case that he makes for the Rambam being a Makubal